Hello everyone, Unit 2, Day 2. I wanted to go over all of what everybody's contributed so far for my presentation. So far I've seen contributions from Shannon, Rosa, and Sarah, and all of us so far have talked about film, which I think is kind of, I believe, the most universally accepted modern example of what the modern panorama could be. I know that we've talked about video games and VR, but I think that those two mediums are a bit more niche in that, not everybody plays video games, like Shannon mentioned, and VR is still such a new and developing technology. So film is something that I think, we've all seen a film. We all know what it feels like to be taken somewhere else, transplanted to another reality through a film. Shannon brought up National Geographic, which I thought was a really good example. An example that I didn't immediately think of because it's so simple, I guess you can say, compared to like a film. A film has like a storyline and a narrative and characters and yada yada, versus National Geographic, which simply has a narrator talking about things that are happening in an environment. So it's easy to digest. And I think one of the purest ways to be transported to somewhere else. Jen also brought up the film Ready Player One, which I'm really excited to see. It looks like a pretty good movie that I'll bring up again later in a bit. Rosa talked about the opportunity to see yourself in a new environment and how that sort of ties into the moving panorama too, because the point of that was to be taken somewhere else and to consider your reactions to being placed in a new environment, I guess, more so for the sake of entertainment purposes, but I feel like it's sort of inevitable that you would consider yourself in this environment that you're seeing and experiencing. Like, how would I play a role in this setting? How would I play a role in this narrative? What kind of character would I be if I were in this world? Which kind of relates to what Shannon was saying and how her husband plays World of Warcraft, and you sort of create an avatar for yourself to embody, to explore this fantasy place. So I thought those two related to each other in that way. Rosa also brought up the viewfinder toy, which I thought was super cool. Those are really neat. I have one lying around. I have to look for it though. I thought that was a really cool example. Sarah talked about, I thought it was a really interesting example that she brought from her personal past, in which she, as a child, would imagine people outside of her car as like extras in a film, despite the fact that they would also feel the same way about her. And I think that that's just another example of relating to characters in another film or a story. I'll stick with film for the sake of being cohesive throughout my word vomit. But it's just sort of considering the actions and the behaviors and the nature of the inhabitants of this environment that you're being transplanted into. I think that's all part of human nature. I think you want to not only consider how you will behave in a new transplanted environment, but you also consider the feelings of others and how others would behave in this new environment that you find yourself in, whether that other be an animal or a human being. I wanted to touch upon bringing up film again, Ready Player One, how special effects these days seem to be one of the main reasons why we see a movie. I think it was, I'm sorry if I'm wrong, but I think it was Rosa who, either Rosa or Maria, who talked about watching older Disney films I think it was Fantasia, in how that film isn't as believable today as it was back when it was originally released, because special effects have come so far, and we as an audience expect so much more from our films that we sometimes may not necessarily appreciate films that have come before, particularly in animation. You know, animation has come so far that when you see an animated film, you expect it to be CGI, like, you know, almost anything that Pixar does, for example. The Incredibles 2, I know that that is a pretty prominent animated film that many people are talking about how realistic that film looks as opposed to how realistic The Incredibles 1 looked when it originally was released. So I think that this is an interesting thing to consider when talking about the development of the moving panorama, and that it seems as if something that is more believable, at least in terms of appearance and aesthetic, something that is more believable is more successful in taking us somewhere else, which is interesting to me. You know, as a child, at least for me, as a child, your imagination is sparked by a lot more things than what you experience now as an adult. You know, 10-year-old me versus 25-year-old me. 10-year-old me would have enjoyed, you know, watching Toy Story endlessly. 25-year-old me leans a bit more towards Toy Story 3 in that, you know, it's more fleshed out in terms of appearance and how realistic it looks and how believable it is, and it more successfully takes me to that world to where I can believe in it and relate in it. I think that's interesting. So I would wonder how a child would react if you were to show them Toy Story 1 and then show them Toy Story 3. I wonder if they would notice a difference, if they would care that there's a difference. I think that'd be an interesting thing to discuss. Lastly, I want to talk about one specific example that I think is really good to consider when talking about the development of film and CGI and special effects and storytelling and the overall goal of the moving panorama. Because again, the moving panorama was meant to entertain and to take their viewers to somewhere else. And Doctor Who is a television show. It's a British television show that's been around for nearly 60 years now. So in terms of the film industry, Doctor Who has gone through so much. You know, it went from black and white to color, and then from color to HD to 4K, you know, all the different sort of technological advancements that we've experienced. CGI, how believable it looks, how the CGI lends to the storytelling, and how the storytelling relates to the viewers. And I want to tie that all back to what I originally said about things being more believable the more realistic they look, and how interesting that is, that we're more successfully taken somewhere else the more realistic it looks. You know, when considering Doctor Who or other sci-fi television programs or films, you compare how sci-fi looks now as opposed to how it did before. You know, oh, like the spaceship looks so much more realistic than what it did in the 50s, or, you know, space is a lot more believable in contemporary film because we've had all this scientific progression and studies to understand more about how space works, like how sound would transfer and be heard in space versus, you know, in the 50s when things were a bit more not as scientifically accurate. So again, what I'm trying to say is the more accurate things seem to be, despite the fact that they're technologically generated, the more accurate and believable they are, the more successful they are. And I think that's interesting. I'm sorry if my thoughts aren't as cohesive as I want them to be. But I hope that I'm getting the point across. The more realistic something looks, the more successfully it takes us to somewhere else, I think. But at the same time, you have the argument that the more fantastical something looks, the more successful it is in taking you somewhere else, because we want to latch onto things that aren't the norm. We want to experience a world outside of our own and have our imaginations sparked. So I'm interested in what you guys think. Do you think that it's more successful of a transplantation if a film that you're viewing is realistic, or if a film that you're viewing is more fantastical? Like, I would use Avatar as an example. Avatar is a bit, almost completely CGI, but at the same time it looks realistic, and that was a majorly successful film, versus something like Toy Story 3, I guess I would use again, as a bit more less realistic in that it's not meant to look like an actual human being, but it's a bit more fantastic. I guess I'm rambling at this point, but I'm just curious to see what you guys think. The more realistic it looks versus the more fantastical it looks. What transplants you guys better? All right. Thanks for listening to me ramble. I hope it made sense. Thanks, you guys.